A few years ago, the French and Indian War was rediscovered and presented to the American public as really important. Why important? Because, to quote a famous title, because it's the war that made America, right? The war that produced in its wake the American Revolution. So basically, it's an observation that after the war, troubles started a bit between the Americans and the British government. The question is why? Why did a successful war lead to the breakup of the empire? That issue is left a bit vague. Okay, so the important thing is the timeline. War ends, problems between Americans and Britain start. Um, so I'd like to give the different possible storylines to illustrate why the historians are a bit vague on how exactly did the French and Indian War make America? How it produced the American Revolution. Because the timeline is clear. The cause and effect connection between the war and the revolution, that's a bit less clear. Now, a former colleague of mine, shout out to Mike Campbell, a former colleague of mine described the relationship between Parliament and the American assemblies as a long-standing marital relationship in which many things in a long marriage, many things go unspoken, which allows the relationship to persist and flourish smoothly. And so my colleague discussed his own marriage and said, look, I know that I'm the leader in my own household, and that the final authority when it comes to important family decisions rests with me. Yeah. And I'm sure that my wife is as convinced that she is the leader and that what she says goes. And we've been living like this side by side for almost 50 years. Now, he says, now imagine what would happen if I came home one day and I told her, now, Diana, we're going to have a talk and we're going to settle this issue exactly. Who holds ultimate authority in this household when it comes to major purchases, plans of retirement, decisions on family affairs, and all sorts of things like that. Okay? What do you think would happen to our nice marriage? Okay? And so according to him, and I subscribe to this, this is exactly what happened in the British Empire, in the transatlantic relationship. Okay? So during the long era of salutary neglect, when the British government wasn't directly involved in managing and wasn't really present in North America and left things to the self-government of local governments here. So during this period of salutary neglect of roughly 150 years, many things went undefined and unmentioned in the transatlantic relationship, working relationship between Britain and the provincial assemblies in the colonies. And then in 1763, right after the French and Indian War, Parliament began an earnest conversation about who is in charge of exactly what in that relationship between the British government and the colonial governments. And pretty soon after this earnest conversation began, both sides lawyered up and things went downhill from there. So the question is, why did this happen all of a sudden in 1763 as soon as the war ended? What prompted this destructive debate about the system of government in the empire, about the nature of our relationship? Where does your authority end and mine begins? So it could have been, like in a relationship, it could have been money problems. Just as financial woes might prompt spouses to argue over who decides on how to raise and spend the family's money, the debate between Parliament and the assemblies might have been a product of the huge national debt that Britain had incurred during the French and Indian War. Okay? It could have been accusations of disloyalty. Okay, so again, just as infidelity might prompt spouses to argue over their respective responsibilities towards one another within the marriage contract, the debate about the empire's governing structure might have been the product of accusations of widespread breaches of trust on the colonists' part during the war. And the fact that during the war, while Britain was fighting the war in America, American settlers were engaged in smuggling, trading with the enemy, profiteering, obstruction of imperial military plans, and the like. Okay, so there's this accusation of disloyalty, and that led to an earnest discussion about the nature of our relationship and who's doing what here. It could be that one partner was evolving within the relationship. So basically that in a marriage, if one person changes, then it prompts a discussion about, hey, what kind of relationship do we have now that you've changed? Okay? So in the century that followed the Glorious Revolution, the Revolution of 1688 in Britain, Parliament was gradually growing into itself and feeling its power and taking the reins of authority firmly in hand from the king, or kind of competing with power with the king and asserting its control over the king in England. Okay? So parliamentarians steadily entrenched and built the notion that everywhere that the king held power, he was checked by Parliament, or he shared his Parliament, wherever the king held authority, Parliament had a stake, had a share in that authority. Okay? And this doctrine of parliamentary supremacy encouraged centralized managerial control, not only encouraged Parliament to take a more centralized managerial control, not only within Britain, but also in the empire, and especially during and then after the French and Indian War. And this parliamentary absolutism was very much in line with European absolutism, royal absolutism. But okay, this claim to jurisdiction everywhere that you see in Parliament during the 18th century, and especially in the second half of the 18th century, during and after the war, was not out of line with developments in Europe, but it was very much out of line with the traditional English habit of self-governance in the New World Empire. So this attitude, this newfound strength and claim to authority by Parliament in its clash with the king triggered in the colonies a traditionalist and localist resistance movement that was it was on display certainly in the colonies, but it was also on display in England and in Scotland. You see it in the Jacobite rebellions in Scotland, for example. Okay, so you have the growth of Parliament, the evolution of Parliament, and that changes the dynamics of the relationship, of the marriage, and the other spouse, in this case, the colonial governments, feel that this is an unwarranted change in the marriage contract, and therefore they need to discuss what kind of relationship do we have now? And then, as I said, this discussion has negative implications for the relationship. It could have been simply a matter of cohabitation. Okay, the two spouses living together in close quarters. Okay, so the French and Indian War, the North American campaigns of the French and Indian War brought colonists and British authorities into close and constant contact with one another. Not only did imperial authorities have to work more closely than ever before with provincial assemblies to sustain the war effort, but the war also placed the British Royal Navy in position to act as a law enforcement agency in American waters, something that never happened beforehand, or rarely happened beforehand. Additionally, tens of thousands of British soldiers served alongside provincial troops during this long war, and then lived among provincial civilians for more than a decade after the war. Okay? So perhaps this close interaction in such close quarters made both sides prickly about their privacy and autonomy, prompting a debate about who was in charge of what in the provinces. It's kind of like if you take a married couple and move them from their nice house into a tiny little apartment, and where they're always right on top of one another, it might make them prickly and make them uncomfortable about the relationship because the setting has changed and they're much more closely exposed to one another all the time, which is how the Americans and British authorities found themselves in during the war. It could be also that the global conquests of the war brought other parties into what had previously been a simple and intimate relationship between Britain and its colonists. So it was a relationship between two entities beforehand, and now all of a sudden, because of the conquests, it brought other groups into the relationship. So before the war, the British Empire was a settler empire. It was made up of colonies in which British settlers governed themselves. And this kind of decentralization was viable and sustainable because these colonies were populated by loyal and patriotic British people. However, the recent war, the French and Indian War, because it was so successful, because the British captured so many new territories and peoples, it brought various conquered peoples under British rule, not only in the American West and in Spanish Florida and in Canada, but also way off in India and in West Africa. In this new context, of an empire that is governing not only British settlers, but also conquered non-British populations, the old model of a decentralized empire of self-governing provinces made no sense at all, because these newly acquired possessions, populated as they were by disloyal populations, conquered populations, this kind of empire would break away, these kinds of territories populated by non-British people, non-loyal people, conquered people, they would simply break away from Britain if they were allowed to govern themselves freely, like the older parts, the older territories of the British Empire. Okay, so the governing model for the empire, for a settler empire, doesn't match, cannot serve the needs of an empire that is governing conquered populations. Okay? So from their central position in London, imperial authorities, including Parliament, had to devise a new way to govern these newly conquered territories and peoples. But this reconceptualization or reorganization of the British Empire naturally took place throughout the empire. You can't simply devise a new governing system for the non-Anglo components of the empire. Okay, for the French in Canada and for the Indians in the West and Spanish settlers in Florida. So, so this reevaluation or reconceptualization of the empire, what kind of empire are we? What level of self-governance do we allow to the people in the empire? That kind of adjustment took place on an imperial level. The only alternative than doing it on for the entire empire at the same time was to have basically two British empires, a decentralized empire for the settler colonies like Massachusetts, New York, South Carolina, Jamaica, Barbados, etc., and then a centrally governed empire for conquered possessions like Florida, Quebec, Bengal. And because this would have been bureaucratically and intellectually schizophrenic, Britain shifted quickly from the decentralized model of a settler empire in which local populations govern themselves to to a different model of a conquered empire that is governed from the center. Centralized empire governed from the center to govern at least some conquered populations that don't want to stay and who would break away if you allowed the traditional form of self-government to them. So, as one would expect, the settler colonies bristled and resisted this abrupt shift in the governing mentality of the British Empire coming from London. And this resistance and annoyance prompted a frank and open discussion between Britain and its settler and the English settlers, the settler colonists in America, about their relationship. You know, what kind of relationship was this? How was it structured? And who wielded authority in these locations? And that, of course, had destructive results. So again, there are different ways of explaining or different ways of seeing the cause and effect between the French and Indian War and the coming of the American Revolution. And these explanations don't line up. You can't say, oh, it's all of the above. Okay, so historians have a hard time specifying how exactly the war led to the revolution, even though they know that that the timeline is clear. And so they know that the French and Indian War was really important. It's the war that produced America, but they have a hard time telling their audience exactly how that is. Thank you.